Hello and welcome. My name is Lynn Barger Elliott, and I'm the executive producer of Completed Life podcasts. Today is the premiere of a Lexicon of Life and Death, a new podcast series where Mark Barger Elliott, the executive director of the Completed Life Initiative, and I will explore the vocabulary we use to express beliefs, hopes, and attitudes towards life and death. While asking what it means to live a completed life, we will probe the way language guides us towards embracing full and whole moments in our lives. Have you experienced a moment that you couldn't find the words to express? Perhaps all you could do is make up a sound or borrow a word from another language just to convey to yourself or to someone else what you felt or experienced. I know a woman who frequently says "ufta" to put a sound around her feeling of being overwhelmed. And when I need to warn someone of a sudden danger for reasons I can't explain, I shout "Vorsicht," borrowing a word I learned in German more than 30 years ago. It literally means look ahead. It makes the sound of what I want to communicate as someone is about to face danger. But unfortunately, very few people can benefit from my warning, as they have no idea what I'm trying to say. I'm someone who enjoys words. Often before I lift my head from the pillow in the morning, I complete a crossword puzzle, a game of Wordle, or letterbox. I consult the dictionary app on my phone several times a day. I look up words I don't know and words I think I know, but heard them used in a way I hadn't considered. Mark, you don't play word games, but you've always been curious about the origin of words.
I am. I find it fascinating to think about how humans came to speak at all. Is it a basic trait of being a human being? Or did humans evolve and develop the skill to use language to communicate? Linguists, those people who study language, well, they have a couple of theories about this. The first theory is what's called the continuity theory, which claims that the idea of language is so complex, it couldn't have just appeared out of nowhere. In other words, it must have evolved from earlier pre-linguistic ways of communicating among our ancestors. Yet other linguists support what's called the discontinuous theory, which argues that spoken language is so different and unique from the way our ancestors communicated. It must have appeared like fairly suddenly. Some have even called it the Great Leap. Perhaps the most famous proponent of this theory is Noam Chomsky, who claims this leap happened about 100,000 years ago or so, like before humans began to migrate from the African continent. Now, there's so much we don't know about language, but there are a few things that we do know. Philip Lieberman, he was a cognitive scientist at Brown. Well, he suggested, and I love this, that spoken language appeared perhaps around the same time in history as jewelry did. Which I find interesting, that at some point in time, and Lieberman estimates it was maybe 3 million years ago or so, as much as you can estimate these things, humans were finding ways to symbolically connect with each other and to express themselves, whether through a necklace made out of shells or a word that was offered beyond a gesture you might make to somebody. We also know that as we come into the world, we inherit language, a set of words to interpret and to express our experiences and the emotions that we feel. But the same language can also limit our abilities to interact with and to describe the world we inhabit. As you said earlier, there's not a word for every experience or emotion. So we say oofda, or we borrow a word like Vorsicht. But we also know that language changes, it evolves. Anyone who's ever read Shakespeare recognizes that words come in and out of use as the world changes, and new words are created to explain new feelings and experiences. I know when we were talking about this series, you shared that Merriam-Webster added 690 new words to the dictionary, like tiny house or grammable, which is an adjective that describes something that's suitable if you're going to post it on Instagram or whatever. So we know a lot about language, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, and it makes sense that our language adapts to how we live and what we observe and how our world changes from year to year.
Hmm.
In this series, the Lexicon of Life and Death, we're going to identify and explore the meaning of some of these new, some of these borrowed words, and suggest how they might guide us as we talk about how we live and how we die. But before we do that, I think it might be helpful to explain the difference between a dictionary and a lexicon. A lexicon is a curated collection of words. It could be organized alphabetically, but doesn't need to be. It's often ordered along themes or groupings. On that note, I thought it was interesting. I just discovered this week that the first known lexicon was actually called Disorderly Words. And that was, I guess, a transparent and perhaps a little playful title that the 4th century author, Philetus of Cos, chose for this lexicon. In no particular order of importance, he explained the meaning and usage of selected words Homer used for the Iliad and the Odyssey. Now, I remember reading those books in high school, and a lexicon would have definitely been helpful. Now, I looked it up. Homer wrote those books in the 8th century BCE, which means that even 400 years later, Philetus of Cos thought his Greek students needed a lexicon to be able to read Homer. Now, unlike a dictionary, a lexicon isn't concerned about being exhaustive. Rather, it's focused on a field of study or a specific topic. For example, early lexicons were created for the study of herbs, which I love, a lexicon of herbs. And that format was quickly adopted for reference books, particularly for law and medicine. A lexicon, therefore, was created to be a guide to help us navigate a topic so that we might learn more and be inspired. In that spirit, in this series, we are going to reflect on a lexicon of life and death. And the first word we suggest might be included in our collection is Sisu. Mark, I know you've done some work on emotions in other cultures and languages. Can you tell us a bit about the word Sisu?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Sisu is a Finnish word, and it literally means guts or intestines. It's uniquely Finnish, means it really has no other equivalent word in any other language. Gutsy might be a close English translation, but even that doesn't fully capture the meaning of the word. Now, any attempt to understand Sisu, I learned, begins with a story every Finn would know. Perhaps like every American knows about the story of Betsy Ross or Ben Franklin flying a kite. Every Finnish first grader to someone who served in the armed forces would know the story of the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. Now, if you remember, this was the time when World War II was getting underway, and the larger and much stronger army of their Russian neighbors to the south, well, they invaded and attacked the small country of Finland. And against all odds, the Finnish army mounted a resistance that maintained Finland's independence from Russia to this day. And what was likely the first known use of the word Sisu in the English language, well, it's found in a Time magazine issue back on January 8th, 1940. It reads like this. The Finns have something they call Sisu. It is a compound of bravado and bravery, of ferocity and tenacity, of the ability to keep fighting after most people would have quit, and to fight with the will to win. The Finns translate Sisu basically as the Finnish spirit. Now, Sisu has been adopted as the essential characteristic of a real Finn. And today, it can mean strength, it can mean perseverance, it could mean to engage in a task that can seem somewhat crazy to embark on. It refers to also this somewhat mystical force that can enable us to continue, that can inspire us to believe. Not just that we might, like we might say in English, you find a second wind, but the idea that there is, in fact, more life in you than you know. I know when we've talked about this series, and we both wondered if we've had an experience of Sisu, or we wondered perhaps if our listeners have had a sense of experiencing that word where, like the Time magazine article put it, we've experienced bravado and bravery and ferocity and tenacity and this sense that, we should keep fighting here. Now, Sisu can be as bold as a small army defeating a global power. But as I've thought about it, it can also be, say, as brave and as bold as a tree spreading roots and growing out of a rock. It can be as fierce as those stories we hear of a bystander finding the strength to lift a fallen limb off a crushed car, or as tenacious as a companion sitting at the bedside of someone who's transitioning from life to death. It can be a decisive victory that inspires an entire nation, or simply holding on to the will to keep going and trusting that indeed there's still more life in us. As I read it about this word, what the Finnish say is that we can choose to Sisu ourselves. And within that emotion, discover there's more life in us than we ever knew. And what we might even think of as these whole and complete moments where we experience what that word means.
Let me ask, is Sisu something you're born with, or can we work towards it? I mean, do only Finns get to feel Sisu, or is this something we can all know and feel?
Well, that's a great question. The good news, as I've read, is that Finns believe everyone is born with a certain amount of Sisu. But they, the Finns, are the lucky ones because, as they put it, they have a word to describe it.
That's great. Which means I guess we are all the lucky ones, for now we all have a word to describe that. Thanks for introducing us to this word, Mark. That's the beauty of language and the gift of a lexicon. In the weeks ahead, we will continue to add words to the lexicon of life and death. We'll look to words from the English language as well as other languages. We'll consider The Genius of Language by Wendy Lesser. We'll look to Susie Dent, author of Past Perfect, and John Koenig, author of Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. In the meantime, we invite you to listen to our other podcast series, Voices of the Completed Life and Gifts of the Completed Life. To find them, please go to our website, completedlife.org, click on the tab marked Programs, and then scroll down to Podcasts. Thank you to Mark Barger Elliott for joining me today, and to Zoe Wilshire, editor of Completed Life Podcasts. If you would like to be in touch with us or have an idea or story for a Completed Life podcast, please email us at info@completedlife.org. Thank you again for joining us today.